to episode 14 of the Tree Lady Talks, and this episode is going to be all about going around the world in 80 trees. How about that?
This is such a great book. It's written by Jonathan Drori, and what an illustrious career he has.
Jonathan Drori, CBE.
That's right. What a privilege it was to speak to him. Such a fascinating book and a fascinating man. I learnt so much. Every single page, I learnt new information about those trees.
You say you learnt a lot. It doesn't take much for me to learn a lot, but I did learn an awful lot from Jonathan. I thought it was fascinating.
You can see Jonathan's full biography on our website, Sharon Hosegood Associates. Just to give you a quick flavour, he's a trustee of the Eden Project, Raspberry Pi Foundation, Cambridge University Botanic Gardens. He's an ambassador for the Woodland Trust, and he's involved with many different organisations. Some of his former roles include head of commissioning and editorial director for the BBC. He's also delivered 4 TED Talks, which are worth checking out.
Okay, so let's go straight ahead with episode 14 of Tree Lady Talks.
Hello, this is Tree Lady Talks, and I'm Sharon Durdant-Hollenby. All music and production is by Noel Durdant-Hollenby, and all views expressed by me or the interviewees are entirely personal. So welcome to Jonathan Drori. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, and thanks for having me.
Jonathan, I've really enjoyed looking at your career history and all the different roles that you have. Could you tell us something about yourself, please?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in southwest London, and my parents were both very interested in plants. My father mostly from a sort of scientific and botanical point of view, and my mother because she just sort of loved the way that plants look. And they dragged us kids off to Kew Gardens, the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, week after week after week. And eventually, I think some of that rubbed off on me. So later on, even though I studied electronics at university and went to join the BBC as an electronics engineer, I then sort of ended up making television programmes about science and eventually sort of drifting more and more into the natural world.
Oh, how wonderful. And you have many roles as well, don't you? Tell us about some of your trustee roles.
I was on the board of the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew itself, actually, for about 9 years. I was on the board of the Woodland Trust. I'm now on the board of something called the Eden Project.
Oh, it's
in
incredible.
Cornwall, to the southwest of England. And I'm on the board of something called Raspberry Pi, which makes and distributes computers to kids and to industry, actually, but specifically we're interested in children learning to program. And the board of Cambridge University Botanic Garden, and I was chairing a university called Ravensbourne in southeast London. So there's a sort of theme there of technology, environment, education. Those are the sorts of things that I'm interested in.
And also, you've presented 4 times at the TED Talks, which people can see online if they just put your name in, which are fascinating about pollination, amongst other things. So we're here today to talk about your book, Around the World in 80 Trees. I absolutely love this book, but perhaps you can explain the premise of the book.
I suppose this is the book that I always wanted to read. And when I went to look for it, I couldn't find it. And I sort of did this as a hobby, around all the other things that I was working on. And I was really surprised when it's taken off and done really well. And I think it's in about 15, 16 languages now. The thing that made it successful is this combination of science, which I hope is reasonably clearly explained and sort of popular, but alongside things like history and folklore and culture that just give everyone a bit of a hook to grab onto, because not everyone comes through science. And I think in that way, there's something in it for everyone. And what I tried to do was tell stories about each of these 80 species. If you like, they're sort of 80 biographies of different species. And my sort of main criterion for choosing the trees was, is there something that would be new to a tree expert as well as a historian or someone who's interested in popular culture or whatever, so is there something new to say? And of course, finding new things to say about species is quite difficult because quite a lot's been written about trees. I sort of think looking at the reviews, I probably just about managed it.
You have definitely managed it. I mean, I'm an arboriculturalist and I learned a lot because I think that there is a issue when you are a scientist or you're in a particular profession, you learn everything about that profession. But it's so enriching to learn about the other aspects of trees, such as history, politics, medicine, food. And it's books like this that really explode your mind and encourage you to sort of think beyond what you've just been trained in.
One gets trapped in, or you sort of have a sort of slightly blinkered view of your own field. And then it's nice to be able to sort of see things outside that. And I think I kind of got a lot of that from my parents, who had these different outlooks on life, but the same values. But, one looking through a sort of scientific lens and the other one looking through a kind of psychology or history or beauty lens. I often think that the most interesting things happen in life at the boundaries between things, either at the boundary between disciplines or the sort of, where you have different cultures mixing, or in environmental terms, if you look at a forest, the most interesting things happen at the edge of the forest, or where there's a glade where the light gets in and, you've got a boundary there. And it's those sort of juxtapositions which I think are really interesting.
They are really interesting, as you say, in terms of the physical world. As you say, the edge of the forest is one of the most biodiverse areas because you've got changes in light and changes in forest structure. But it's also interesting in the emotional and intellectual world. And one of the themes we've been exploring is collaboration with other professions, but also working with people and talking to people who are lay people and come up with the most original ideas that you wouldn't have thought of yourself, because it's easy to be straitjacketed into a line of thinking, and that is the way that we do things.
When I give talks at festivals and things, people ask questions. And some of the most interesting questions are from kids, because they don't know about the difference between a daft question and a sensible question, as if there is such a difference. They just ask away, and they ask just the most delightful things, like, if you want biodiversity, what's the best tree to plant? And that takes you into a whole conversation about native trees, which have grown up with all the other little critters and things that there are around, as opposed to things that we import, which, our insects haven't evolved to munch on. You won't get the same biodiversity around. So, it's very interesting to then talk to them about oak trees and so on. Oh, they're just full of great questions. I love all that.
The book goes around the world in 80 trees. So you start off in the UK and you work your way around. But rather than going for individual trees, there are some themes that I really picked up on. And with each tree you write about, you describe it, first of all, pretty much in each paragraph. And I think everybody knows how beautiful the bark is on silver birch, but you write about it so beautifully.
Let me read a little bit for you. With cascades of delicate pendulous branches that sway in any breeze, the silver birch is as graceful as a ballet dancer. Its fluttering leaves are pale green diamonds, serrated and borne on slender twigs, warty from their resin glands. Its implausible paleness is an adaptation, helping trees that lack the shade of dense foliage to keep cool trunks in the day and night sunshine of a northern summer, or in the glare of snow. The bark of young birches is invitingly smooth. As the tree matures, however, thickened, dark, corky patches appear near the ground in order to protect the tree from fire. The thickened bark can be boiled to extract a tarry resin that inspired the Latin name betula, from the same linguistic stock as bitumen. Some 5,000 years ago, the locals used bark resin as an antiseptic chewing gum. Pieces have even been found that still bear tooth marks.
So the themes that you discuss are history, music, and let's come on to a good old glass of wine. For years, we've been opening our wine using a corkscrew. 10 years ago, suddenly you could buy wine with a screw top. And people thought, that's convenient. But actually, that's had quite a bad effect on the ecosystem, hasn't it? You write about the cork oaks.
Most of the cork in the world comes from the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal and southern Spain. And the cork forests, which have been cultivated by human beings, though they're a sort of human construct, those have been cultivated for, hundreds and hundreds of years. And there's a whole kind of ecosystem that has developed around those, with lots and lots of interesting and quite rare animals, insects, and so on that depend on those trees. And the way that the cork is harvested by taking the bark off the trees is absolutely sustainable. That doesn't kill the trees. The cork has evolved in the cork oak to protect it from fire, so much so that it was used on the space shuttle, actually. They harvest the cork in such a way that the tree survives and just grows another layer after about 10 years or so. And of course, if there's no demand for the cork, then that thing on its own isn't enough to sustain the economy locally. Because, yes, the pigs, which make Serrano ham, they feed on the acorns, but that's not enough on its own. They need the cork as well to sort of sustain the whole business. And so if people start replacing cork with screw tops, then that ecosystem will die. It won't be protected anymore. And that's a terrible shame, because lots of important animals and other species will go extinct.
And actually, you can see that ecosystem in a micro form at the Eden Project. There's in one of the biomes.
Yes, that's right. The Mediterranean biome. The biomes are sort of huge structures. If you Google the Eden Project, you'll see they're sort of massive domes. The Mediterranean biome has some lovely, lovely cork oaks.
So, folks, if you drink wine, buy one with a cork in, a proper traditional cork, and keep that ecosystem going.
The thing that triggered the development of the screw tops rather than people using cork was that for a period their farming practices took a bit of a dive, and some of the cork got contaminated with fungal contaminant that made ever such tiny quantities of a chemical that we're very, very sensitive to. And so wine would take this sort of unpleasant smelling note from that. Wine that had that was called corked. They cleared up that problem decades ago, but unfortunately the screw tops have taken off. So drink more wine, everyone. Drink lots of wine and make sure it has a cork in it.
And talking of pleasure, music is a big feature in the book as well. So you talk about how different trees and timber are used in music, and particularly Norway spruce, and that slow-growing timber makes the best sound.
It depends what you want to do with the wood. So if you want to make the sounding board of something like a cello or a guitar, what you need is a material that is very, very stiff, but very light for its stiffness. That's the key quality that you're looking for. What you want is a wood that, when you knock it, it almost kind of sounds like a bell. It's got that kind of resonance to it. And it turns out that Norway spruce is fantastic, and that's the best thing for making guitars and cellos. And the place that has the best slow-growing Norway spruce, and has had for centuries and centuries, are the Alps of northern Italy and the mountains of Switzerland. And there's just something about the combination of the soil, the climate, the distribution of the species itself that has meant that that's the place to go. And so it's no accident that the best violins made by Stradivarius were from that part of the world. And when he was making his violins in the sort of 16th, 17th century, the Earth was going through something called the Maunder Minimum. Leaving aside all the climate change stuff, the sun has a sort of cycle to it where it goes through cold phases and hot phases. And it was going through a particularly cool phase. And, the world was a bit colder. And so there was a particularly cold period. And the trees that grew up in that period were growing exceptionally slowly and had extra dense, firm and light wood. That's how those violins came to be so fab.
Wow, the things that you learn. And is climate change affecting the quality of the timber, do we think, for the violin and cello industry?
It's bound to. What will happen is that the best trees for making instruments with will be further and further up the slopes. The tricky thing is that they'll have been growing at one rate for the last 200 years, and they'll start growing at a different rate because the temperature and the rainfall has changed. And so there won't be the same consistency. So it'll be possibly harder to find some of the wood that we need for making those instruments.
Wow. Could it even change the way that we hear music?
Yeah, possibly. People have, in the same way that they sort of put away fine wine, they put away fine pieces of wood, often for, 10, 15, 20 years, to sort of slowly dry out and just sort of get absolutely right.
Another theme of the trees is history. And I absolutely loved hearing about, in the section about Alder, about 16th century Venice and the shipbuilding, and the fact that the woodlands and forests were so highly managed.
People have used wood and wood's properties for thousands of years, and have therefore managed woodland for thousands of years as well. And I think it's really important to remember that the trees have evolved with lots of these fantastic characteristics, not for our purpose, but for theirs. So when you have trees that have resins and things like cedar trees, they wanted that for shipping, but and for making coffins and things that would last forever. For the tree, they're trying to sort of ward off insects. And the alder tree is quite a common tree in Britain and in Middle Europe, and it often grows near water. And there are two things that give it an advantage. One is that it's got this sort of very clever relationship with some bacteria that live in little nodules in the roots. And that allows it to get some of the extra sort of fertilizing chemicals that it needs, that it wouldn't be able to get otherwise in waterlogged soil. It does another thing, which is it's particularly good at fighting off rot. So, the bacteria and fungi and so on that would normally make things rot in somewhere that's very wet, alders are very good at resisting that. It's quite strong wood as well. So the Venetians had this terrific idea that they'd impress the hell out of everyone that they did business with by building a city in a lagoon. But how do you build a city in a lagoon? And the answer was that they drove piles made of alder wood into the soil beneath the water. And the Ponte Vecchio and half of Venice are still on 500-year-old alderwood piles. Alder was the most fantastically strategic wood. They not only used it for building on, but they also used it for making charcoal, both for smelting steel and also for making gunpowder with. So it's a component of gunpowder. So if you've got steel, you can make weapons, and if you've got gunpowder, you can prime those weapons. And alder was arguably the basis of this sort of maritime power in Venice that projected all the way around the Mediterranean. And at the height of their power, they could build one ocean-going warship, fully kitted out and fully complemented with explosives. They could build one a day.
Can you imagine a film about that? One a day. The organisation. I had no idea.
It was done in a building called the Arsenale, and that's what's given us the term arsenal. That's where that comes from. And of course, as you started out by saying, it was such a sort of strategic and planned operation. So they had, forest inspectors and they had forest guards, and they branded trees and said, that is ours and you can't go anywhere near it on pain of death, and, all of that kind of stuff. Really, a strategic material.
Fantastic. And of course, history, trees are integral to so many stages in our world history, such as White Mulberry with the Silk Roads, and also rubber, rubber trees around the world, from, as you put, from condoms to car tires, and how that has shaped society and also, the social history and some sad things about that as well, how people were treated.
Yeah, a lot of these the materials that came from the trees, they were commodities that Europe depended on or came to depend on, and they needed labour to cultivate them, or they would go over and sort of overexploit the forests or what have you. Rubber was the subject of one of the first cases of biopiracy, where on behalf of Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, people went out and stole rubber plants and then took them to Malaysia, the other bit of the British Empire, where we could sort of corner the market by growing huge amounts of rubber. And Henry Ford, the car manufacturer, hated the fact that the British had a monopoly on rubber, and he decided he would set up this enormous rubber plantation in the middle of the Amazon forest. And he cleared a great area of it, and he built a town for all the workers. It was called Fordlandia. And it was a great white elephant because they didn't really employ enough botanists who would be able to say, look, if you plant this many rubber trees all together, they're all going to get pests and diseases, and, here's how you do it differently. And he also had lots of sort of funny rules for the workers, like, they weren't allowed to have any women on site, and they couldn't play football. And it was just sort of mad. Mind you, Henry Ford is a pretty weird guy. And the whole place just sort of got deserted. And there's the remains of Fordlandia in the middle of the Amazon rainforest.
And these are the sorts of stories you can read about in this book. It's just a reminder about balsa wood. I think many people remember carving balsa wood when they were younger, perhaps in woodwork at school. They created our planes in World War II, didn't they?
Yeah, there were planes made out of balsa wood. It's very light and quite stiff for its weight. It's very, very light. It grows fabulously quickly, and some of these very quick growing things, have that sort of property. Those sort of latexes and, like rubber that I mentioned, the tree has developed those or evolved those to sort of engulf insects or heal wounds, something rubs up against it. It's just sort of like its own elastoplast. And rubber is obviously very well known because we make car tires out of it. But there's another material which is much less well known, which is another of these trees that you get a kind of white latexy sort of sap out of if you cut the tree. And that's gutta percha. It's another one of these trees. It's from Malaysia, Borneo originally, that has this white latex that's there to protect it if insects attack it or if it's scraped or whatever. But it has this amazing property, the latex, that it can make the most fantastic waterproof insulator, electrical insulator. Now, you might think, well, that seems a bit dull. But the first submarine cables that spanned the Earth and allowed people to talk to each other on the telephone for the first time were all insulated with this material. And there was a complete run on gutta percha, and there were all these sort of entrepreneurial companies that people were investing in and bidding up the price of, and all of that in sort of Victorian England, all based on gutta percha. And after a couple of decades, there were 250,000 miles of gutta percha insulated cables spanning the Earth, and our phone calls were all going through those. And the other use of gutta percha at the time was to make gutties, which were the material for golf balls that enabled golf to really take off as a sort of mass sport, because you could sort of manufacture loads and loads of these really easily. And the only use for gutta percha nowadays is for making dental implants.
Isn't it incredible that a tree has enabled the world to communicate?
Yeah, I think it is absolutely, incredible.
And you talked earlier about latex is originally formed by the tree to encase insects. One of the things I loved reading about in your book is a complex relationship between insects and trees.
The relationship between insects and trees is, extraordinary because, on the one hand, insects often attack trees and eat them. On the other hand, trees often depend on insects to pollinate the flowers, because that's how they make baby trees. So there's this kind of love-hate relationship between trees and insects. And sometimes you get these really complicated and wonderful relationships. So in the fig trees, there's this really, really baroque kind of relationship between tiny little wasps and the fig fruit, which is a kind of a delightful but kind of jaw-dropping thing. There's another one in East Africa called the whistling thorn. I really love this one. I mean, these thorn trees, believe me, are absolutely viciously covered in these very, very sharp thorns. But despite those thorns, large animals like elephants would come along and either sort of accidentally trample the things or sort of eat them despite the thorns. And the tree has evolved with these sort of little houses that it's made, little kind of spheres at the base of the thorn, which are hollow, that ants come and colonize. Not just any old ants, but the world's most aggressive and horrible ants. And these colonies of ants take over the base of the thorns. And when anything brushes against the tree, they all come out scurrying and looking for a fight. And they aggressively sting and bite anything that will come their way, including if there's another tree nearby with another colony of ants and the two branches swish together, then they'll fight to the death. Elephants don't like ants any more than you or I, so they have learned to keep away. And one of the things that keeps them away from the tree is that when the wind whistles through the tree, it creates a particular sound because of the shape of the thorns that the elephants recognize, and they just trundle away. And here's the amazing thing, that if you play a recording of that sound to a group of elephants in the neighborhood, they all kind of amble off because they associate it with ants.
Tree Lady Talk.
And also about how trees feed us. Well, there's the obvious way of fruit and nuts, but I was interested to read about the mapani tree.
The Mopani woodland is a particular kind of ecosystem, just like we in Britain would recognise a sort of beech woodland or an oak woodland, or in the United States they'd recognise an aspen woodland or something like that. People in sort of central southern Africa, countries like Botswana and so on, would recognise Mopani woodland, and it's quite a sort of nice, airy, open woodland, quite delicate trees, lovely sort of feel to Mopani woodland. One of the things that really, really loves Mopani leaves more than anything are these Mopani moths. The caterpillars feed on the leaves, and somehow they don't kill the trees, even though they eat all the leaves, but the leaves seem to grow back really quickly. And they grow back faster than if someone just comes along and takes the leaves off. And those caterpillars are used locally by millions of people as food. They take the caterpillars, which are about the size of an index finger, so they're quite big, and squeeze them to sort of eject whatever happens to be in their guts at the time. It's a bit disgusting, this. And then they get dried and probably a bit of salt and chili pepper, and, you can fry them and whatnot. They're an important source of protein. I've noticed that caterpillar and insect protein is just beginning to be more acceptable in Western societies. Just before the COVID lockdown, I was at an underground station in London where, for some reason, The Economist magazine was promoting itself with protein bars, but with protein in them from insects. It's beginning to be a thing.
It is beginning to be a thing, isn't it? And it may be an environmentally friendly solution to obtaining protein.
They're being a bit over-harvested in Botswana now because there's a sort of export market to South Africa. And it's not because it's just such a great food, although it is a useful food, but people really enjoy them, the way we would eat crisps.
But talking about other funny, more unusual food, I was interested to read about the Szechuan pepper. Tell us about that. I wanted to try some straight away.
So Szechuan pepper is actually not related to either the bell peppers that we know or the pepper spice. And Szechuan is an area of southwest China. The Szechuan pepper tree has these sort of little berries on it with seeds inside, which can be harvested and dried. And you see them in Chinese markets all over the place, and in the sort of Chinatown markets that we have in the West, in our cities. And English is a rather poor language, I've discovered, for describing this stuff, but because we don't even have separate words for chili hot and heat hot. Yeah, we have to say, well, that's spicy hot, as opposed to burning your mouth, and that's sort of irritating, actually, that we need separate words. So in Chinese, you not only have a word for chili hot and for heat hot, but you have another word for Szechuan pepper hot. And Szechuan pepper hot is a completely different sensation. You know how if you take a mint and you put it in your mouth and you breathe in, it feels cold, even though it isn't really? Well, Szechuan pepper does a different thing. It makes your mouth feel like it's buzzing. It feels like someone's actually sort of puts something that's vibrating against your mouth and tongue. It's a very, very odd feeling. And the closest I've come to it in any other circumstance is putting my tongue on a little 9-volt battery.
Tree Lady Talks warning, don't do this at home. But it kind of reminds me in the 70s when I consumed a huge amount of sweets, as we all did then.
Oh, yeah.
Space dust.
And that sort of crackling in your throat.
Yes, exploding mouth.
And so the Szechuan pepper, it has this particular spiciness, but the sort of buzziness, and it makes you salivate like crazy. So I remember giving some to my, I think he was about 18 at the time, my son. The look of sort of pleasure and then horror. He was sort of dribbling because obviously I gave him quite a lot.
Another tree that really had a huge part to play and still does in medical history and therefore geography is quinine. It's
actually a native of South America. It turns out to be a cure, basically, for malaria, which wasn't native to South America, but was brought there by the Spanish from Africa. The bark contains this sort of very, very bitter chemical. When people worked out that it could cure malaria and prevent malaria, it enabled the European colonization of the tropics. So this was a tree, another one that really changed the world, because without it, the Europeans who went out there had a very, very short life because they had no immunity to malaria. And for good or ill, and one could argue it either way, quinine and the cinchona tree really sort of enabled the European colonization of the tropics.
And all through a gin and tonic. So, I mean, that's really where gin and tonic comes from. I don't want to be flippant about sort of political geography and history, but that's how it was drunk, wasn't it? There was powdered quinine with sugar.
Quinine is disgustingly bitter. I mean, it is more bitter than you can ever imagine. It's horrible. And so they had to find a way of making it more palatable. And exactly as you say, they used sugar and fruit juice and all sorts. That was the sort of the basis of the gin and tonic. That's how it arrived. And obviously adding alcohol, helped.
So we've talked about the medicinal properties of trees that we know about, but there's so much more to learn, isn't there? And all the greater reason to take great care of our sort of wild areas and rainforests, because there could be untold benefits within those trees that hasn't yet been explored. Would you agree?
I completely agree. Yeah. I mean, it's, I think we should protect species from extinction anyway, because I just think that's the right thing to do. We share this planet with others. But also, just from a practical point of view, there are lots and lots of things that will be incredibly useful to us that we just haven't had a chance to research yet. Little flowers in Madagascar that turn out to contain, chemicals that we can treat cancer with. Trees that we can breed or use for better timber that can replace some of the sort of concrete and steel we use in our buildings. Even down to what people rather grandly call ecosystem services, sort of preventing flooding and, those sort of things.
Yes, that's right. As well as all of those, they also contain these wonderful properties.
I feel like you and I are sort of preaching to the converted, aren't we? Because you're an arboriculturalist, a sort of very highly qualified person when it comes to trees, and here am I, a sort of a tree lover and amateur and writer about trees. Sometimes I wonder how people like you and I can best excite the people who aren't necessarily sort of completely wild about trees. And I suppose that was the motive for the book,
This book is a book that the layman can read. It is a recurring conversation that we have within our industry. I'm all for trying to get things out into the mainstream media. And the podcast, I hope, and I think, isn't just listened to by tree people and people involved with land. I know some people who have nothing to do with it, but we've got to get the message out there. And it brings me on to probably the last sort of theme of your book, which is a sense of community and phenology and place, which is really epitomised by the Yoshino cherry.
There's something sort of very special about the Yoshino cherry for the Japanese, and it's this concept of mono no aware, which is kind of translated into, the wistfulness of things. It's the idea that something is kind of beautiful and exquisite, but just temporary, that it's going to disappear. And that concept often appears in sort of Japanese culture, and I think it's one of the reasons that the Yoshino cherry is so special there. I mean, it was a huge deal in Japan, sort of trying to work out the provenance. Was it originally from Korea or was it from Japan? And sort of, I think the genetic scientists who worked on it came out with the right answer, which was we're not absolutely sure. But it's Hanami time, when blossoming of the cherries sweeps through from the south to the north of Japan. It's a kind of national festival, and they report on the news, where it's got to. And one of the reasons it's so special is that the flowers on cherry trees come out before the leaves. Against a blue sky, you just get this burst of pink and white blossom, and so it's partly the beauty and partly the fact that it's a sort of sweep through the nation. There's something about it not being permanent. It's just a sort of temporary, beautiful, wonderful thing. The closest we have in English to this concept is a sort of wistfulness, a beauty, but in a minor key. And it's very moving, I think, for that. And I think that appeals to the Japanese sensibility.
It is a real spectacle. And I think on a much broader sense in the UK during lockdown in spring, because we had such a beautiful spring this year, people really appreciated all of nature. Perhaps some people, they really noticed it for the first time because, you know, they were just in their immediate area or looking out their window at blossom. So,
and in London, we could walk down the middle of roads, which, you know, we can't normally do, which is an amazing thing for looking at nature.
So in developing countries, it seems to me that people have lived in harmony with the trees and understood by ingenious exploration every aspect of the tree. For example, argan oil and the kapok tree. I mean, I tend to think that we've become complacent and wasteful as we've moved towards a sort of biochemical products and technology. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that one of the things that's happened is that we've become removed from nature. So, you know, those of us who live in cities, and even in the developed countries, you know, in rural places where, you know, where farming is so industrialized and mechanized, where we have so sort of few species, you know, biodiversity is very much reduced. We're sort of rather separated from nature and can't necessarily see how we're connected. And I think that's very dangerous. If you can't see how you're connected to something, you won't value it. And if you don't value it, you won't protect it. To me, it's a bit like, you know, that sort of parlor game, Jenga, where you've got, you know, lots of little bits of wood in the tower and, you know, you take turns to take one out and still leave the tower standing. As we put more and more pressure on ecosystems and we take species out or they become extinct, it puts more pressure on the others. And there comes a point where it still looks stable, but it actually isn't. And it only needs a tiny little perturbation, a tiny little movement, one other thing just being done to that ecosystem, and the whole lot collapses. You know, I think that's a sort of very sad byproduct of us not living in harmony with nature, but disconnected from it.
I absolutely agree with you, but there is more of a movement amongst the general population to beginning to understand about the importance of nature. I definitely have seen that in the last 12 months in the work that I do. And with the climate change protests and marches before COVID, you know, there seems to be a groundswell of appreciation that I do hope isn't blown away as we all get excited about getting back to normal and start tearing about in our cars and consuming things that we don't need to.
I hope you're right. I think it's very difficult for people to see that their own actions actually kind of impinge on nature. You know, so the thing that is causing the most biodiversity loss is what we feed animals. And we feed animals in order for us to eat either their meat or drink their milk. You know, if you look at the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, which will affect us all, that's being driven by the need to grow soy and corn, maize, in order to feed to animals. 85% of it goes to feed animals. That's a fantastically inefficient way for human beings to exist. You don't have to go vegan overnight. And if you did, then, you know, that would give farmers a very difficult time and all the rest of it. But if you think of the continuum between, you know, at one end of the scale, you're eating sort of 5 meat meals a day. And at the other end of the scale, you're vegan. Why not just move along the scale a bit? And just sort of be progressive about it. So, you know, if at the moment you have 2 vegetarian meals a week, then, you know, sort of make it 4 and try that for a few months and try and make it social as well. Well, I mean, we can't at the moment because we're all locked indoors, but when we can, you know, if everyone brings a dish and it's a sort of social thing, you learn from each other because we need to learn about how to make vegetarian food really nice and appealing and all that. And then gradually, you know, reduce the amount of vegetarian and increase the amount of vegan. That would have an enormous effect on the planet. You know, if everyone ate like devout Hindus eat, in other words, a sort of almost pure vegetarian diet, our footprint on the planet would be so much less. You know, I mean, and, you know, just general consumption of stuff. I mean, I think one of the biggest problems we've got is how to move from the society we have at the moment, which is sort of predicated on using more and more stuff and the growth of companies, to sort of actually using less, but without putting people's jobs in danger and, you know, having cities boarded up when we go into, you know, sort of recession, you know. But how do we move from the society we're in, where we keep using more and more of things, to one where it's not all hair-shirted and horrible. People feel happy and fulfilled and delighted, but we're not just using more stuff. That's the big question.
It is certainly a big question, and certainly one of employment as well. So I think there's a real opportunity for people to be employed in green industries and actually to do things differently, increase the number of organic farms that are more labour intensive, to actually plant and manage woodlands and to manage open spaces effectively for conservation. And I think there's a real opportunity for some retraining of people who've lost their jobs. It seems there is a real skills gap in green industries. We haven't got enough people who are trained to do these jobs, yet we've got people who've become sadly unemployed. And if people could work in things which are more sustainable and don't affect the planet, have a positive effect rather than a negative effect, that's my hope.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very wise, and I think one of the ways of making that happen, because if you're a government, say, would be to announce and stick to a progressively increasing carbon tax. And the reason that would work is it starts small and keeps creeping up, so everyone knows where they stand and they can plan for it. But it means that all that sort of entrepreneurial activity and all the sort of clever creative stuff, from the market will solve the problems. So it'll become less financially competitive to have industrial farming with loads and loads of inputs, which require lots and lots of energy to make. We use loads of fossil fuels making fertilizers. And the organic farming that you talked about will become more and more economically viable. And that means that people will immediately say, well, we need to train people to do this, just in the way that you're describing. So the way that it would make all these things start working would be progressively, in my view, progressively increasing carbon taxes.
I'm just going to plug your book, Around the World in 80 Trees, which is also beautifully illustrated.
It's illustrated by Lucille Clerc, and the publisher, Lawrence King, did this fantastic job on it. So it's available in both paperback and in hardback. And it's if you just sort of feel the weight of it and stroke the paper, it's amazing. And it's all sort of forest-friendly paper and all of that kind of thing, and forest-friendly inks. And so it's but it is it's sort of one of the things I've noticed. It's like sort of watching people in a shop looking at Apple products. They pick up the book and then they go, "Ooh, this is nice."
Oh, it does feel nice. I'm absolutely obsessed by books, and I love to run my hand across the relief of the text on the front cover. It's absolutely beautiful. And for me, we've talked about so many themes rather than the biology and description of the trees that it's almost around the trees in 80 ways. But finally, John, what's your dream scenario?
My dream scenario would be actually that we find a way to progress as a society from what we're doing now, which is not sustainable, to a scenario where people can feel happy and fulfilled and have sort of fun lives without feeling that they need to consume more and more all the time. So, in other words, people are gainfully either employed or occupied doing kind of fun and interesting things. They feel their lives are worthwhile, but it's not all based on consumption. I think that would be my dream scenario.
Thank you so much for your time. Absolutely love talking to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. Thanks.
Ah, yes, the Ponte Vecchio Bridge in Venice. Yeah, I've walked over that a few times. I had no idea it was held up by alder trees.
Wasn't it fascinating?
Fantastic. It was really, really interesting.
I had no idea the way we communicated around the world was due to the gutta percha tree.
And we found out the origins of the word arsenal.
It's not too late to buy a book for Christmas.
Okay, so I'm slightly confused about what's going on next week because there are 3 colours involved. We're interviewing Mr. Howard Gray from Green, Blue, Urban.
Yes, it'll be really interesting because they're such an innovative company and very keen to share their expertise to help people find solutions to plant trees in really difficult urban environments. So listen out for that next week.
And there must be one more thing in your Christmas stocking that we're going to get out.
Yes, we're doing a special short series for Trees, People and the Built Environment, where we speak to key people who are presenting or chairing or being a partner of that conference to get to know them behind the scenes. So watch out for that series.
This series of interviews is going to link to an online event that the Institute of Chartered Foresters are putting on in February, otherwise known as Trees, People and the Built Environment 4, which was actually going to be a conference event live, but obviously because of situations I can't do it.
So it's going to be really exciting, but if you want to check that out, just Google Trees, People and the Built Environment and see the hosts of speakers, some of whom are going to be on our little podcast short series.
Or go to charteredforesters.org. Don't forget you can download this episode at podcast.sharonhosegoodassociates.co.uk. Find the Tree Lady on Twitter at
Tree Lady 67.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Sharon Hosegood Associates. And you can get us on Instagram.
The Tree Lady Talks.
So in the meantime, till next week, it's goodbye from me and it's goodbye from her. Goodbye.